Without any further delay, I'm going to hand you over to Professor Victoria Baines for tonight's lecture, How Surveillance Works. Thank you.
It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. This is, of course, the remarkable opening of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, his novel set in the French Revolution. Now, it's a work of fiction. It's written 7 decades after the events it describes, and by an Englishman at that. But it shows a profound understanding of surveillance and its consequences. It is infused throughout with the language of what Dickens calls universal watchfulness. Even the towers of Notre Dame are personified as watching. It highlights tensions between secrecy and transparency and the capacity of surveillance to be driven by various motivations and for various purposes. And all of this has relevance for our understanding of how surveillance works today. The novel's atmosphere of constant vigilance finds its embodiment in the character of Madame Defarge, one of the tricoteuses who have taken to knitting at the guillotine. She's motivated, at least in part, by her sister's violent assault at the hands of the elite. And she comes to symbolize the most vengeful aspects of the revolution's anti-aristocratic activities. When we first meet her, she is described as having a watchful eye that seldom seemed to look at anything, a large hand, heavily ringed, a steady face, strong features, and great composure of manner. She is at once an agent of surveillance and totally inscrutable. In fact, we later learn that she's also an expert in counter-surveillance, encoding in her knitting the names of those she identifies as deserving of execution. The word surveillance first enters the English language shortly after the Revolution in 1803. J.G. Lemaistre's rough sketch of modern Paris includes a visit to the world-famous Gobelin tapestry manufactory, where, quote, the workmen are not locked up, as was the case during the monarchy, but they are kept under the constant, quote, surveillance of the police. So that English word surveillance is borrowed directly from French. The verb surveiller is essentially a contraction of the Latin super, meaning above or over, and vigilare, meaning to keep watch. And it's perhaps easier to see this heritage in the Spanish word for to supervise, supervigilar. In ancient Rome, there was a dedicated military unit known as the vigiles, the vigilant, the watchful ones. It was originally established as a fire brigade, and it consisted of several thousand watchmen, many of whom were freed slaves. As well as maintaining public order, especially at night, the vigiles came to be associated with undercover surveillance. In the early 2nd century CE, the Stoic philosopher Epictetus describes a typical scenario in which a soldier dressed like a civilian sits down by your side and begins to speak ill of Caesar, and then you too, just as you received some from him, some guarantee of good faith, inasmuch as he began the abuse, tell likewise everything you think, and the next thing is you are led off to prison in chains. Now, in modern terms, that's not just surveillance, that's entrapment. At around the same time, the poet Juvenal gives us a particularly vivid description of the dangers of living at Rome. And I have to stop here and tell you quite how excited I am about this, because finally, after 3 years of Gresham lectures, I get to talk to you about my PhD. Hooray! Now, one of the characters in Juvenal's satires tells us that various perils, diversa pericula, await you at night. Among them, a drunken thug who is looking for a fight, loose roof tiles, and catapulted crockery. And he concludes from this that you could be considered careless and ill-prepared for the unexpected if you go out for dinner without having made a will. As you pass by at night, there are as many threats to life as there are open windows watching you. Vigiles fenestrae. So, cross your fingers and utter a pathetic prayer as you go that they'll only empty their basins on you. So just like Dickens' Notre Dame, here even the architecture is engaged in surveillance. And it's my assessment that in choosing the word vigiles for this personification, Juvenal is deliberately encouraging us to think of the police force of the same name, watching our move by day and night, as ready to tell tales as to empty their slop buckets. Now, ancient Rome lacked public prosecutors, and instead, individuals brought criminal charges against each other, regardless of whether they were the injured party. Rome's most famous prosecutor, Cicero, argued in his work On Duties that accusing others, as he himself did quite frequently, was not reprehensible in itself so long as it was in the public interest. And yet, he writes, a limit should be set even to that. For it seems one must be a heartless man, or rather, one who is almost inhuman to be bringing capital charges against one person after another. It's not only fraught with danger to the prosecutor himself, it's also damaging to his reputation. Now, Cicero's concern for how accusers might be viewed was well-founded. After delivering no fewer than 14 speeches denouncing Mark Antony, he was executed as an enemy of the state, and his head and the hands that penned his speeches were displayed in public as a warning to others. Later on, in the imperial period, Rome saw the rise of a particular class of informers, the delatores, who made accusations for personal gain, and they were incentivized by entitlement in law to a portion of the accused's property if convicted. In the reign of the first emperor Augustus, this came to include prosecutions for adultery, and words or behavior that threatened the majesty of the emperor. Where there is money to be made from denunciation, it's natural, isn't it, for people to move from what they happen to observe to what they can proactively gather through surveillance or intelligence. And in a dictatorship, accusers may be motivated as much by fear and self-protection as by the prospect of personal advancement. Demonstrating loyalty to a regime by throwing heat on others can, of course, serve to reduce the heat on oneself, however temporarily. And the biographer Suetonius writes that by the time of Nero's reign in the middle of the 1st century CE, the tail was wagging the dog. Nero ordained that all words and actions upon which any informer could ground a prosecution should be deemed treason. So pretty much everything could be framed as an insult to the regime. Our satirist, my favourite Roman author, Juvenal, imagines a scene in which even catching a massive fish puts one at risk of being accused of treason. The skipper of the boat decides to give the monster to the emperor Domitian because, he writes, who would dare to buy or sell such a whopper in days when even the coastline is crowded with informers? Denunciation as an expression of loyalty features repeatedly in the context of the French Revolution, where each commune had a committee of surveillance, and where failure to denounce was itself framed as grounds for suspicion. Against this backdrop, the regular appearance of the eye of providence in French art of the time takes on particular significance. The state is all-seeing when everyone watches their neighbours. It's the deadliest form of curtain twitching. Denunciation can, of course, also be an act of retribution, and this was something Dickens picked up on. In addition to giving Madame Defarge a vendetta, he bestows a nickname on one of her lieutenants, the Vengeance, la Vengeance. The perception of being constantly under surveillance can change one's behaviour. In the 1st century CE, the philosopher Apollonius of Tyana had to defend himself against accusations that included human sacrifice, performing magic, and conspiring against the emperor Domitian. According to his biographer, he described Rome as a city where there are so many eyes to see and so many ears to hear things which are and are not, and one which prompts prudent and sensible people to walk slowly even when engaged in wholly permissible pursuits. So surveillance can be a deterrent, producing at least an outward semblance of compliance. And this is something that is proposed wholeheartedly by an English contemporary of the French Revolution. Now, we have met this chap before in my 2023 lecture on encryption. This is Jeremy Bentham, or rather his auto-icon, a wax likeness of his head and his preserved skeleton dressed in his own clothes, still on display at University College London. In 1787, Bentham published a detailed proposal for a system of surveillance, which he called panopticon, or the inspection house. It's remembered largely as a design for a prison, but it was in fact intended for any institution in which large numbers of people either needed to be watched or feel as if they were being watched. And the function of the panopticon was to enable a handful of inspectors, a single inspector even, to supervise a large number of inmates. It did so by making those inmates constantly visible, so that any of their activities could be observed at any given moment. From the central tower, the inspector can see everything, including all the inmates, and crucially, without being seen. And the effect is what Bentham celebrates as a new mode of obtaining power of mind over mind. It's since been critiqued, perhaps most famously, by the 20th century historian and philosopher Michel Foucault in his work Discipline and Punish, as the ultimate illustration of surveillance as an instrument of power. Now, there are evident echoes of this design in Victorian institutional architecture, and yet it's clear from Bentham's original text that he saw this as a more humane solution to the overcrowded and insanitary conditions of 18th century institutions. So for schools, he suggests that the use of either sex might by this means sleep as well as study under inspection and alone, which he claims is a circumstance of no mean importance in many a parent's eye. For Bentham, the panopticon promises an improved society without violence. He foresees, quote, morals reformed, health preserved, industry invigorated, instruction diffused, public burthens lightened, economy seated, as it were, upon a rock, the Gordian knot of the poor laws not cut but untied, all by a simple idea in architecture. But from a 21st century vantage point, it's difficult not to view this as Orwellian and as a prototype for some of the worst excesses of authoritarian regimes. Equally, we may see parallels with our use of digital technology today, particularly in the way continuous sharing of data about our lives makes us more visible than ever, more of the time. Okay, so much for what history tells us about surveillance. But how does it work now? We are going to look at the UK regime because that's the one with which I'm most familiar. The Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act provides for surveillance by public authorities, including police forces, the intelligence services, the armed forces, and some government departments. And it defines surveillance as monitoring, observing, or listening to persons, their movements, conversations, or other activities and communications. Surveillance can be overt, as in the case of CCTV, assuming you can see it. It's deemed to be covert if it's carried out in a manner that is calculated to ensure that any persons who are subject to it are unaware that it is or may be taking place. Covert surveillance in the UK regime further divides into directed and intrusive surveillance. Intrusive surveillance, broadly speaking, is anything that's conducted on residential premises or in a private vehicle. And directed is anything else that is likely to result in obtaining private information. The level of intrusion determines the approval required. Intrusive surveillance usually requires a signature from the Home Secretary. And various safeguards are built into the process. This is a bit of a throwback in time for me because 20 years ago, I used to make applications for directed surveillance on people suspected of supplying crack cocaine and heroin. And I used a form just like this one. I had to set a time limit for the operation, which for me in the police was 3 months, but for the intelligence services is 6 months. I had to show that the surveillance requested was necessary on the grounds that it was for one of these purposes, and my drug dealers fell very squarely under the second criterion. I also had to show that the measures requested were proportionate to the suspected offence and that the information we sought couldn't be obtained by any other means. Now, it's my professional experience, but it's only my experience, that these principles are not simply nice to have, they are enforced. When it emerged a few years ago that some local councils were using covert surveillance to investigate activities such as dog fouling, barking, misuse of disabled parking badges, and putting rubbish out on the wrong day, their powers were reduced. They can now use directed surveillance only to investigate more serious offences and subject to judicial approval. Applications also need to demonstrate that they have assessed the risk of intrusion into privacy of persons who are not the subject of the investigation. For example, the family or co-workers of someone suspected of an offence. and that they've taken steps to limit that intrusion where possible. And those principles of necessity, proportionality, and minimizing collateral intrusion have been front and center in efforts to standardize surveillance practice across the world, such as the international principles on the application of human rights to communications surveillance. But let's take a practical example. Let's do a semi-live surveillance operation. I'd like you to imagine that you have received intelligence that a red-haired woman is dealing drugs in the local park at 4 p.m. most weekdays. Okay, here's the park, and you identify a potential observation post. There we go. And you set up a camera. And lo and behold, in the footage, there's this person with red hair. But you think you need to make sure that they're the right person. This could be a case of mistaken identity. And there you go. In another location, you see this suspicious-looking character. This passerby certainly seems to think they look quite dodgy. You can't be sure, but it looks like they've left something on the ground behind the tree. They then make to leave the park, and your mobile unit follows them to a house. I know what you're thinking. There's something about this hardened criminal that looks oddly familiar, isn't there? Forensic analysis, meanwhile, of the package behind the tree reveals that it contains illegal drugs. After further research to identify the target, you conduct surveillance on their home address. And through the open back door, you can observe that they are on their computer. So just in this very brief surveillance operation, you can see there's potential for collateral intrusion into the privacy of people entirely unconnected to the suspected offence, people in the park, people potentially in the house. There are considerations over the level of intrusion into a private space. And there's a potential opportunity to access communications data to identify any other parties in the supply network. Now, 20 years ago, I already had access, subject to due authorization, to quite a lot of information about persons of interest. Who was using a particular phone number? Who was calling whom? And even if, as was often the case then, drug dealers were using prepaid mobile phones to avoid being identified, as long as we knew the phone number, we could see when and where the credit was being topped up. We could already, to some degree, track their movements and communications by the data they created, when they used a particular cash machine or point of sale, or when their car had been spotted by automatic number plate recognition, ANPR. But fast forward 2 decades, and 2 things are quite obvious. Firstly, we are all generating so much more data. And secondly, that data is being exploited by different actors for different purposes. So you will know that parking providers now use ANPR to register your vehicle and fine you if you don't pay. And you're on CCTV on public and private property, whether you choose to smile or not. And this includes use of live facial recognition, which compares you to wanted criminals in real time. And there is, of course, now a treasure trove of your private communications, geographical locations, photos, videos, thoughts, and feelings, at least those you have expressed. So, for instance, solely from the metadata for my photos, you could, I think, make an educated guess about where I spend most of my time. The data each of us generates can be requested by public authorities with the relevant authorization, but not all countries apply the same safeguards. And the companies who generate data on you, or to whom you volunteer that data, use it for a variety of purposes, from combating fraud to market research to targeted advertising. As we saw in my previous lecture, data is used to profile us, to sort us into groups and types, and to manipulate what we see and experience, often for profit. And it's become fashionable to call this surveillance capitalism, after Shoshana Zuboff's hugely popular book. But it's not only big tech, retailers, and advertisers monitoring our online activity. It's also prospective employers checking to see whether we are their kind of person. It's our current employers measuring our productivity in a much more granular fashion than clocking on or time and motion men ever could. It's also, isn't it, each and every one of us. Humans are naturally nosy, and digital technology risks turning all of us into voyeurs. Which of us can honestly say, please don't put your hands up at this point, which of us, though, can honestly say that we have never Googled an ex-partner or former friend or searched for them on social media simply out of curiosity? We see much further into other people's private lives than we ever have before. And some of this is actually staged for our benefit. Influencers create online content with an air of intimacy. They blur the lines between our traditional conceptions of public and private space. It's not, strictly speaking, covert surveillance if they invite us in and they know that we're watching. And yet it can, nevertheless, sometimes feel a little intrusive, even voyeuristic. Others of us may monitor our children's online activities and communications with the aim of keeping them safe. The dark counterpart to that is stalkerware, apps that can be installed surreptitiously on someone's devices in order to track them and intercept their messages. And inevitably, this kind of surveillance technology is used by abusive partners engaged in coercive control. The wealth of publicly available data on so many of us has given rise to a new role in society, the open source investigator. And these are people who, for a range of motives, track other people across digital services. Now, as the term open source suggests, the focus of this kind of data gathering is primarily public information. But what constitutes public information on the internet is moot. We can safely say that data someone publishes on their own website is open source. But what about a post on a social media platform or another digital space for which a viewer would need to set up an account, follow the target, and perhaps even conceal their true identity in order to do so? For government authorities, conducting a search of open source information can constitute directed surveillance, and it can require due authorization when it's targeted on a specific individual. Private and amateur investigations have no such constraints and no such protection in the law. This digital vigilantism is embodied by the self-styled paedophile hunters who conduct online investigations that one might otherwise expect to be led by the police. They often operate undercover, posing as children in the hope that adults with paedophilic urges will engage with them and arrange to meet. Now, this kind of sting operation is heavily regulated if it's conducted by government authorities, but no such rules apply to private individuals. And as a result, there have been cases where evidence collected in this way has been inadmissible in court, where groups have interfered with police operations, and where the desire for vengeance and public humiliation has led to violent assaults on individuals identified as suspects. Some of these vigilante groups certainly have something of the spirit of the committees of the French Revolution, the accusateurs. And in the UK, their activities are so prevalent that not only can you genuinely buy this T-shirt online, but their evidence is increasingly used in prosecutions, and the Crown Prosecution Service has had to issue guidance on their status in the law. This kind of amateur activity is prompted, at least in part, by what is perceived to be police inactivity. And it highlights a paradox. As much as digital technology now provides vastly superior means to surveil us, the result is very often too much information for the authorities. Two alternative strategies have therefore emerged, and the first is an attempt to move away from targeted surveillance of suspected individuals in preference for collection of bulk data sets on all of our communications. In 2014 and in 2016, again, the rationale for this was summed up by then Home Secretary Theresa May in parliamentary hearings as follows. If you are searching for the needle in the haystack, you have to have a haystack in the first place. In 2016, she added that while citizens did not give their explicit consent to have their data harvested by the security services, there was a, quote, unwritten agreement that it was needed to keep us safe. I'm not so sure that everyone agrees with that. In fact, I would hypothesize that citizens are becoming increasingly privacy and security conscious. And this appears to be borne out by steady growth in user numbers for privacy-enhancing technologies like encrypted messaging apps and anonymizers like virtual private networks. Now, I used to work as a cybercrime investigator, and we used to call these counter-surveillance measures because they obstructed identification of criminals and interception of their communications. But they're now being used much more widely by the general population, and that in turn suggests that we are all becoming more aware of surveillance by various actors and ways to evade it. Another strategy is to put the responsibility for surveillance onto tech companies. And the logic goes that they are collecting vast amounts of our personal and private information in any case, effectively conducting their own mass surveillance, so they can also conduct operations that would otherwise be the remit of government authorities. This is noticeable in emerging online safety legislation around the world, where the focus is not so much on prosecuting the humans who commit criminal offences using digital technology, but more on platforms monitoring our interactions for harmful content and removing it from our experience. It's a highly normative process that enforces a given community's morals, and which in turn interacts with growing self-censorship in digital spaces, sometimes known as chilling effects. And those appear to be fueled as much by fear of social alienation as by censure from the authorities. Many of us are understandably worried about how we will be seen by others. The risk is that awareness of surveillance by governments, companies, and our fellow citizens doesn't just deter bad behaviour, but also free expression. Where CCTV may make us self-conscious in a limited geographical area, digital technology exposes us to the gaze and therefore the judgment of the entire world. And the internet doesn't forget. witness the trend right now for online communities and the media to denounce public figures for unpleasant or ill-advised comments that they may have posted online as children. At this point, it is important to acknowledge that in some disciplines, surveillance is a neutral concept. In my previous lecture, you will remember that we saw how John Graunt's analysis of deaths recorded in 17th century London heralded the development of public health surveillance, monitoring the population for causes of death and diseases with the aim of reducing both. Related to this is wastewater surveillance, which can detect the presence of contaminants in sewage, enabling the spread of viruses to be tracked ahead of time. With suitable safeguards, you can see how this could be a good kind of surveillance. As with all data collection and analysis, safeguards need to apply not only to how the surveillance is conducted, but also how the output is used. For example, it's been proposed that wastewater surveillance could be used to identify the level of psychoactive drugs in communities. And tests have already been conducted, which corroborate information from international organisations, including my old employer, Europol, that the retail market for cocaine is expanding in Eastern Europe. Now, we might reasonably expect these findings to inform a policy response in those countries, perhaps to assign more funds for education programs or for support for those with problematic drug use. But we would probably consider it a step too far. We may well consider it disproportionate if the police were to identify people in those regions as drug users simply on the basis of this data set and enforce against them accordingly. But in an age of increasing use of artificial intelligence, these are precisely the concerns of legislators such as those in the European Union, where the AI Act now bans the use of automated profiling for predictive policing and criminal prediction systems. We've also seen popular resistance to technologies that are perceived to be conducting surveillance without our knowledge or consent. It is now over a decade since early adopters of Google's smart glasses found themselves branded as glass holes and banned from establishments over fears that they were recording everyone in their sightlines. And last year, a woman with whom a government minister is alleged to have had an extramarital affair was banned from the Italian parliament for filming with a pair of Ray-Ban Stories smart glasses. It was only when the woman posted the video on social media that the authorities became aware of it. And so there are, I think, two considerations contributing to hostile reactions to this kind of technology, over and above the annoyance or intrusion we may all feel when someone holds up a smartphone in front of us. Firstly, the fact that data may be captured surreptitiously by devices that can't obviously be identified as cameras. And secondly, the fact that these devices are perceived to be always on, always capturing whatever the wearer sees, wherever they look. Throughout history, we also see evidence of the popular belief that one-to-one communication is private and should remain so, and challenges to that privacy. For my 2023 lecture on encryption, the Sun newspaper very kindly ran an online poll on our behalf. In answer to the question, should the government have access to your online chats, 84% of those who responded, so that's just under 28,000 votes, said no, absolutely not. In my 3 years of lectures here at Gresham, we've considered means of frustrating attempts to intercept private correspondence over millennia, from the cipher used by Julius Caesar to John Wilkins' 1641 treatise on cryptography, and to modern security standards for our digital communications. The prosecutor Cicero, for his part, was certainly aware of the potential for his personal correspondence to be intercepted. In a letter to his friend Atticus in Greece, a full 15 years before his execution, he cautions, "Some events have occurred since you left me that are worth my writing to you, but they must not be trusted to the risk of a letter being lost, opened, or intercepted." And revolutionary France initially balked at the idea of reading people's private correspondence. In the summer of 1789, a heated debate ensued in the General Assembly, with supporters arguing that interception was justified by the emergency circumstances. Belief in the sanctity of private correspondence was at the fore of another key moment in surveillance history that has come to be known as the Post Office espionage scandal. On the 14th of June, 1844, a petition was presented to the House of Commons here in the UK that the Home Secretary, Sir James Graham, had authorised the interception of the letters of Giuseppe Mazzini, an exiled Italian nationalist living in London. Information extracted from Mazzini's letters at the General Post Office, just down the road here at St Martin-le-Grand, was shared with the authorities in Austria, from whose empire Italian states were attempting to gain independence. And evidence subsequently came to light that this information had led directly to the arrest, torture, and execution of Italian nationalists. The public outcry at the time was considerable, amplified by radical politicians and notable intellectuals. And in a series of cartoons, Punch magazine ridiculed the Home Secretary, depicting him as Paul Pry at the post office, printing the fictitious contents of what was claimed to be his own intercepted correspondence and comparing him to, horror of horrors, the French police minister, Joseph Fouché. The magazine also gave away humorous counter-surveillance devices, among them these anti-Graham wafers, envelope seals with mocking slogans. Charles Dickens got in on the act, writing on the envelope of one of his letters, "It is particularly requested that if Sir James Graham should open this, he will not trouble himself to seal it again." One of the functions of satire is to hold people to account. Here is my very good friend Juvenal in a medieval woodcut, clearly wagging his finger at someone. And accountability is a key consideration for surveillance. It can take the form of official oversight by the judiciary or independent review bodies. And in the UK, that's the remit of the Investigatory Powers Commissioner and the Biometrics and Surveillance Camera Commissioner for CCTV in public places. But because secrecy is so important to the success of covert surveillance, public transparency can be challenging to obtain, even in regimes where there is independent oversight. Accountability can also take the form of what is known as surveillance, watching the watchers, enabled by the fact that we all have cameras ready to hand and the means to broadcast live to the rest of the world. Civil society organisations play an important role here too, especially for countries where there is low government accountability and where citizen dissent is either prohibited or otherwise dangerous. A phrase that we often hear in this context is, "Who will guard the guards themselves?" And you've guessed it, this too originates in Juvenal's satires, where the question in the original Latin is quis custodiet, ipsos custodes. What we don't hear so often is the original context for that question. Satire number 6 is a diatribe against women. It's incredibly graphic, it's arguably not safe for work, and it's definitely not safe for children. In one of the cleaner sections, the speaker tells us, "I know what my old friends would say and advise. Lock her up and keep her indoors. But who will guard the guards who get paid in kind to keep quiet about your girls' dalliances? It's a conspiracy of silence. The savvy wife sees to it and starts with them." In 2025, this reads rather like an incel complaint or a misogynist soundbite of the kind we might expect to see on social media from the likes of Andrew Tate. It demonstrates the importance of context in all of our assessments of surveillance, be they past or present. But it also highlights the complex and problematic role of exposure. The speaker in Juvenile Satires is letting us into the secrets of just how terrible women are, exposing what he claims has previously been concealed. It's a recurrent feature of satire through the ages, but it's also very similar, isn't it, to the drive for publicité seen in the French Revolution, where the desire to expose the secrets of the aristocracy and other traitors was paradoxically accompanied by, and arguably prompted, an expansion of covert surveillance. We should, I think, at least be thankful that the revolutionary committees did not have access to the internet. The history and current practice of surveillance is, in fact, full of paradoxes and competing imperatives, often represented as trade-offs. For society to be safe, we must accept intrusion into our privacy. Those charged with conducting surveillance themselves enjoy a degree of secrecy. Government authorities and big tech companies alike are bent on having access to huge amounts of data captured by digital technology that they can't make sense of without the help of automation. Transparency and accountability are now of the utmost importance, but as we have discovered, once people realize or suspect that they are under surveillance, it can change their behavior. And this can, of course, be precisely the aim. Historically, surveillance has presupposed a person watching and a person watched. And our terms for its related concepts reflect those various aspects of vision and visibility. And yet, as surveillance increasingly entails automated data collection and processing, it would seem that it is less a business of seeing and more one of profiling, albeit in some cases using techniques that mimic vision. Broadly speaking, surveillance today has the same practical and societal functions as 2,000 years ago: to gather information that can be used, to monitor and control the undesirable, and to promote the desirable in the eyes of the collector. But the sheer amount of data now available for automated profiling must surely give us pause for thought about whether the game has changed. AI experts will tell us that it is important to keep a human in the loop of automated decision-making. And this would seem to be especially true with regard to surveillance, where it's all too easy for safeguards to be threatened simply because the technical ability now exists to monitor individuals on an unprecedented scale. Automated profiling can also make mistakes, as we saw in my lecture last year on data protection, when I discovered that X, formerly Twitter, had identified me as male based on a host of presumed interests, many of which were in fact incorrect. So we may find ourselves tempted to update the opening paragraph of A Tale of Two Cities with something like this: It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of safety. It was the age of insecurity. It was the epoch of transparency. It was the epoch of secrecy. We were more human than ever. We were more datafied than ever. We all strove to watch without being seen. We had not much to hide, but something to fear. In short, the period was so far like the previous period, and yet so unlike it, that some of its noisiest surveillance experts insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. If I were having one of my less modest moments, I might even wager that Dickens, as a fan of paradoxes and the imagery of surveillance, wouldn't mind all that much. Thank you.